Welcome back to This Is How We Create. My name is Martine Severin, your host. What happens when a sociologist writes for Marvel Comics, or when a poet uses data to tell stories about systemic racism? When someone refuses to choose between the academy and the streets, between rigorous research and Afro-futurist fantasy? Today on the show, we speak with Dr. Eve L. Ewing, a writer and educator who has made boundary crossing her signature move. From her groundbreaking poetry collection, Electric Arches, to her acclaimed run writing Ironheart for Marvel, Eve has built a career on the radical premise that ideas should choose their own forms, not the other way around. Her latest work, Original Sins, challenges everything we know or everything we think we know about American education. Eve argues that our schools weren't broken by accident. It's systemic racism, people. She posits that schools were designed to create the very inequalities we see today. Other than losing myself in Eve's poetry or through her writing, I love that Eve uses her imagination as a tool for liberation. She does this artfully, whether she's crafting superhero narratives or envisioning futures where Black communities thrive and thrive well. Eve, I am so happy to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much. What a generous introduction. I feel so seen.
Well, I didn't talk about knitting, which we could talk about later.
Yeah, I do. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
So, Eve, you grew up in Chicago. Can you tell us about your childhood and your exposure to the arts?
Sure. Well, I feel really lucky that Chicago is a town where I had so much experience with interacting with artistic practitioners and at least at the time that I grew up, that was not something that was kind of reserved for elites. It was something that was accessible to working class people as well. So the first museum I ever remember going to in my life was the National Museum of Mexican Art, which is in Pilsen. And that's a free museum. And every year they do this amazing Day of the Dead exhibition where they have all these community made ofrendas that are created by community artists. And so I remember, going to that and just being around visual art and writing all the time. And when I was a teenager, I became involved in a lot of youth writing programs that would really kind of shape my identity and a big part of who I was. One was called Gallery 37, which is now known as After School Matters. And that was actually a program that would pay teen artists to be kind of like apprentice practitioners in the arts. And that was sponsored by the city. That was like a result of public investment in saying that young people making art is important. And then the other nonprofit that really shaped my life a lot was Young Chicago Authors, which is still a huge part of my kind of like social circle and artistic identity. So yeah, I feel really grateful. And I often, this is an imperfect comparison, but I think that like if you grow up in New Orleans, music is so much a part of the fabric of that city that even if you're not a practicing musician, it's just like in the lifeblood of everything around you. And for me, growing up in Chicago, I felt that way about reading and writing, that, learning about people like Gwendolyn Brooks and Sandra Cisneros and Carl Sandburg, in second grade, third grade, really gave me the sense that like, it's part of our birthright as Chicagoans to tell the stories of regular people. So I feel really grateful for that.
I grew up in Boston and moved to Chicago via London because we spent some time in London. And, Chicago is
Very different cities.
very different cities. Oh my gosh. Boston and Chicago are very different.
Yeah.
Obviously, the population size is different. Chicago is such a bigger city, but it has a special place in my heart. I never thought I'd live here, but it definitely has a
Boston or
special place in
Chicago?
Chicago. I
Oh,
grew up
gotcha,
in
gotcha.
Boston.
Gotcha, gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I spent 5 years in Boston, and I feel like actually a big part of my identity as, like, a cultural organizer was really nourished in Boston because I had so many opportunities to kind of put into practice the things that I had received as a young person growing up in Chicago. I was a young adult, co-programming with my friends and comrades, like, trying to create those same opportunities for young people in Massachusetts. So, yeah, that's also a very special place to me. But I'm a Chicagoan through and through.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how your family background and your community influenced your values and your sense of self?
Well, when I think about family, I think about that both in terms of biological family and kind of chosen family. So I was raised by my mom, and she moved to Chicago when she was 19 years old, which is like incredible. She kind of just like, was out in the world seeking her fortune. And, she raised me and my brother as a single mom in, a big city where she didn't have any biological family. And so we also had a lot of chosen family in terms of, Aunt so and so and, all my mom's kinds of friends and coworkers and people that helped to raise us. And I think that gave me a sense very early on in terms of shaping my values. Number one, I always saw my mom, even when it was not easy to do so, choosing pathways in life where her work allowed her to uplift social issues and things that were important to her. And so I sort of took it for granted. You get these kind of like unspoken implicit messages about what work is and like what a job is, what a career is from your family at a young age. And you get these implicit messages about what work is and what a career is from your family at a young age. And for me, I just took it for granted that like good work means work that helps other people. Like that's the purpose of work. And that's something I very much observed from my mother's example. But then also the necessity of chosen family in our lives, the way we had to rely on neighbors and friends and chosen fam to really support us in just like logistical things like picking us up from school or helping us in an emergency. That I think really grounds my politics in the present, where a lot of what I'm always trying to do when I'm thinking about community support is like just starting with some of the basics of food and housing and showing up for people, because my childhood, my upbringing would not have been possible if people had not shown up for us, for me. So yeah, I think that really shaped my values and shapes how I think about that kind of work. Is also a form of creative work, because it is in that practice that we create the world that we want to see. And so I feel like that's a message I internalized a lot as a young person.
I grew up in Haiti. So for me, it's very difficult for me to untangle personal obligations and community obligations. I always think about how the work that I do benefits the community. So it sounds like, your mom and how you grew up had a really great influence on you as well, and very much affects how you approach your work today.
Yeah, and I will say, like, thinking back across generations, my mom, I think for most of her life, my mom would not identify as a Christian, although she grew up in church and she's now very active in church. And I think that for her, church is about, not just from like a theological perspective, a sense of identity, but like a place where you show up and think about building that kind of collectivity. And her mother, my grandmother, was very, very, very involved in her church and was like the president of the choir. And then my grandmother's mother was like a founding member of their family church. And I was lucky enough a few years ago to be going through some of my great grandmother's papers. And I found this receipt from basically like the church loan fund. And it was almost like basically like a mutual aid, like rotating cash fund where you could get a loan from the church and where you as a member could also like pay into this loan fund. And I felt very moved by that because I thought about, the ways that Black people have been excluded from formal systems of lending, right? From banks and mortgages and things like that. And I think about what it means for a group of Black people to say, like, we are going to create this kind of mutual aid fund instead. And so I think that the church is also like for many Black women, this kind of like multi-generational example of what it means to show up and think about service in your work, and the way, as you put it, like the impossibility of disentangling personal obligation from like community obligation and community identity as well.
Thank you for that. So, as we move forward, I want to get into how you started writing. So, you were part of Young Chicago Authors, but can you talk to me a little bit about how your interest in writing evolved from writing to now mainly doing this both as part of your profession, and I'm assuming as well as, in terms of like keeping your soul, your artistic soul alive.
Yeah. I have been writing as long as I can remember. I sometimes when people ask me in interviews like how long have you been a writer, I'll say since birth. Like I think that, I remember kind of like writing my first, coming up with my first little like rhymes and songs when I was like 4. And my mom, when I was around 5, I remember like typing my first stories on the computer at her job. And what that meant was just like an MS-DOS command line. And so I would just be, just writing just basically like dialogue. And it was just like characters from shows I watched on TV, like talking to each other. Like 90s Nickelodeon shows like Hey Dude. Like the first thing I remember writing down was some Hey Dude fan fiction on MS-DOS. And I think I remember it I think that's such a tangible memory for me because it's like somebody who worked in my mom's office like came and looked over my shoulder and read out loud what I was writing. And I feel like that was so mortifying. But then when I was in elementary school, I remember writing a poem about my guinea pig that passed away. I wrote that in first grade. And I remember that the teacher was like, "This poem is so good. I want you to go across the hall to the other classroom and tell Miss Hughes that I said, like, I sent you to read it out loud to the other class." And now having been a teacher, I wonder about that moment. I'm like, in some ways I was not always like the easiest kid to teach, especially at that age. And I wonder if she was like, I really just need a break and I need to send her out of the room, for I need like 5 minutes without this kid in this class. So I remember that. And then when I was in second grade, I actually won a writing contest it was called the Illinois Young Authors Competition. And it paid, a small, like some support for young people in each grade level to write stories and you could win a prize. And so I wrote and illustrated a story called Santa's New Suit, where Santa gets tired of wearing the same thing over and over. And so he goes out and he gets a bull's hat and a bikini and some Nikes and starts trying to deliver presents that way. And then everybody is like super freaked out by this and they don't like it at all. So he throws the old clothes in the trash can. And I won a prize for this. And I was invited to come down to Springfield, Illinois, the capital, to receive my award. And it was the same day as I had a T-ball game. And I skipped the writing awards to go to the T-ball game. And that is the origin story of how I obviously had a very unsuccessful writing career and instead became a professional T-ball player. No, just kidding. Yeah, I made a choice. I made a choice at age 7. But I think like so yeah, I've always been writing, but I remember a particular moment when I was in 7th grade. A good friend of mine said to another adult in front of me, she said, "Well, Eve is just such a good writer." And up until that moment, even though it was something I did and cared about a lot, I didn't think of myself as a writer at all in terms of my identity. I mean, I had a lot of interest. I was interested in science and social issues and all these other things. And at 12, hearing a fellow 12-year-old say to somebody else, like, "Eve is a writer," I thought to myself for the first time ever, like, maybe I am a writer. And I always talk about that moment because I think what it really taught me is that like it instilled in me a commitment to always talk about people's gifts out loud and to never assume that somebody knows or that somebody has like a salient understanding of themselves as being good at something or able to do something. And with my students, with my friends, with like children in my life, I try to take a moment to just say like, "Wow, you're really good at this. You're really exceptional at this." Because you never know what that unlocks for somebody, and yeah, that moment of being seen by somebody else was really important to me.
Well, Eve, I have to say, like, I love your writing so much. It brings me so much comfort. I don't know what it is about your writing. It's soothing. It makes me angry, depending on which book I'm reading
Yeah.
of yours, whether it's your poetry or in the case of Original Sins. Can you talk to me about how you aim to improve your writing over time? Because writers, they start one way and then they have an idea, or not just writers, most artists, right? They have an idea of where they want their art or their skills to be sharpened and where they want it to go. How have you kind of walked that line in terms of blooming, continuously blooming into your, I guess, your skill?
Wow, what a thoughtful way to put that. And thank you for saying that about my work, that it's comforting. I think that's I'm not sure that's something I've heard before, and I really appreciate that. There are two things, right? You can be a writer as just like a person who writes, and that's something that anybody can do and that all of us have the possibility of doing, like writing as a form of creative expression. And then there's this other funny thing, which is like being a capital W writer as a job or being an author, right? Where all of a sudden this thing that maybe, you loved as a child is a thing where like you're trying to earn money and you're trying to make deadlines and you have these professional goals. And the thing is that even I've been stunningly enough, like so fortunate to move into that second kind of writerly life. But the first part, the part where you're just sort of driven, like a shark that doesn't stop swimming, like you're just sort of driven to create, like that part is always there. And I think you have to be intentional about making sure that you're nourishing that part amidst all the technical parts of like making the deadline, trying to win the award, get the grant, whatever. So for me, I think that like I am a little bit addicted to or compulsive about learning and stretching new things. One of my best friends and collaborators, Nate Marshall, he told an interviewer once to like the Tribune or something like that he said like being my friend can be exhausting because he said it's like doing calisthenics. And I do feel this need to always be moving, stretching, doing, fidgeting. And I think that it is a joy for me to extend that into my craft so that to use your delightful choice of words, so that there's always space for me to bloom. Or I would even extend the plant metaphor and be like, sometimes I'm like, when you see a plant in your window that you haven't turned for a long time and it's like stretching towards the window and it's pulling itself over. It's like sometimes I'm blooming, sometimes I'm like stretching a little too far in one direction and I need to be rotated. Sometimes I'm like, my soil is dry and it needs to be replenished. And so some of the ways that I do that, number one is like by just talking with my peers a lot, reading their work in progress, sharing my work in progress for their feedback, hearing about their projects when they're in nascent form. I love that. I love hearing about something at the very, very beginning. I love checking in with people like, how's this going? What are you stuck on? And sometimes in my life I've been incredibly fortunate to like actually have sustained time to sit down and write with other friends and like check in with them throughout the day. I had a pretty blessed period of my life where I was spending a lot of time in DC with Elizabeth Acevedo and Clinton Smith and Safia El Hello. And we were just like writing together and checking in together halfway through and saying like, hey, I'm really stuck on this. So I think like continuing to build that kind of community is really important. And then I love listening to writers I admire talk about their craft. And I learn so much from that every time. I listen to a lot of podcasts of writers talking. I love reading old interviews with writers. I love, the proliferation of things like Substack where writers are kind of talking publicly about their process. And then just like observing and trying different things, seeing something and saying like I think that one of the ways that we teach poetry, right, is that we like a standard poetry workshop is that you show your participants a couple of examples of something or an idea and then you try it out with them, right? Like and there's this kind of mimesis that's like the first step of learning. And I think that for me that remains important. And so especially if I'm like trying a form of writing that I haven't done before or a type of genre that I haven't done before, I love to like try to copy to learn, right? And not in the final product, but as like a kind of exercise to say like, how could I write a sentence that looks like this? Or how could I come up with a scene that does this thing in the way that this other scene does? And I remember Kaveh Akbar, who wrote the incredible novel Martyr. Kaveh and I went on a road trip together right when he was like before the book was published. I think it actually hadn't been sold yet. So I think maybe he was like finishing the draft or close to finished, but he hadn't actually sold the book. And we were talking about it. And, he's like an astounding poet and he's also an astounding reader of poetry. And I remember him telling me that he really wanted to write like a novelist's novel. Like he really wanted to go all in on the idea of story and narrative in a way that he hadn't had to as a poet before. And, he talked to me about just like watching so many movies as with this particular lens of like trying to use film as a way of learning and understanding how you craft the arc of a story in a tight way, you know? And so I just love stuff like that. I love talking about it with people. I love listening. I love reading. I love trying. I think honestly, I say often, like publicly, that I don't like writing, like the process of writing. I don't like sitting in front of a computer and trying to write, which, is partially just me being like self deprecating and dramatic. And I think also a lot of writers are like that. And I think that that's a part of the process that I really enjoy. I really enjoy trying to do like a little bit of forensic craft analysis on something and figuring out like, okay, how did they do this thing? I think that's really fun for me.
We had Edwidge Danticat on the show, and she talked about when she has an idea before she can actually start writing, that she goes through about 10, 12, 13, up to 18 notebooks filled with that
Oh, wow.
idea, and then going through and trying to get to the meat of it. And I'm wondering for you, as we wrap up, when you have a thought or an idea, first, where do you capture those ideas, or do you capture those ideas? And how do you wrangle them? How do you get to the point where you can actually start a project or start a book?
Oh, now you're getting into the real deal. Also, I mean, now I'm like, well, I need to go copy what Edwidge Danticat is doing because, I aspire to have a fraction of her talent and ability. But so I think that this is, usually when people ask me genre questions, I'm very dismissive and I'm like, writing is writing. But actually, I think this is one area where the form of what I'm trying to make sort of does matter. And so I capture things differently based on what it is that I'm trying to make. So for poems, I have like massive document that at this point is probably like, ooh, 13 years old, something like that, where I'm just always, if I think of a great line or if I have an image in my head, I pull it up and I dash that out. And I sort of just like, it's a little bit like having lentils in your pantry. Like you don't like, sometimes you have a plan for it. And sometimes you say, let me just stash this away here for the future, like a can of beans. Sometimes you're like, I know I'm going to make black bean soup on Sunday. And other times you're like, it's probably just a good idea to have these beans here because you never know. So oftentimes with poetry, especially because I have a poetry, my next like completed manuscript is actually going to be a manuscript of poems for young children, which that's kind of moving forward to the production stage. So other than that, I don't have like a live manuscript right now for poetry. And so if I have that kind of idea, I just want to stow it away somewhere and maybe come back to it later, maybe not. I had a poem that was published on the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day a couple years ago, and it was commissioned by Honoré Fanon Jeffers, and I was really lucky to participate in that series. And it's the poem is called Eschatology, and it's kind of about the end of the world. And the kind of central lines and themes and images of that poem just sort of lived in my head, knocking around for a few years. And then when I was approached and asked, do you have something? That was the time to then kind of try to stretch the taffy into something consumable for somebody else. But so I think poetry is different in that regard for me from work that centers around like thesis or an argument where it is very the type of nonfiction that I write tends to be work in which I am trying to make fairly audacious claims that by their nature are challenging what people think they know or understand about the world. So Original Sins is one example of that, right? Where I'm trying to like fairly forcefully overturn the way most people think about an institution that they interact with every single day, which is in one way, form or the other, which is schooling. And I'm thinking also of like a few years ago, I wrote an essay for a Vanity Fair that was about police unions. And basically I was trying to make this argument that police unions are not really unions, right? So my nonfiction work tends to be of that nature. And because of that, I spend a lot of time trying to reverse engineer an argument that will be both concise and clear, but also convincing enough that it like passes a series of stress tests. And at the same time, with my nonfiction work, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like you read a really, really great essay and you take a walk with a friend or you're chatting with them over dinner and you say, I read this really great thing the other day by, such and such writer. And, they made this point. and your friend says, "Oh, well, that's interesting, but what about this?" And you say, "Oh, yeah, well, they actually talk about that. They say this," right? And when an essay or something you've read like that is really good, you actually find yourself in a colloquial situation, able to recount the author's argument off the top of your head without the thing in front of you, and then also like field a reasonable amount of like potential counter arguments or questions. And when I've read really amazing things, I'm able to do that at a dinner party or, like in a chat with a friend. And so when I write a piece of kind of a persuasive prose, I'm trying to work backwards from that moment. I want to write something where a person who does not have the text in front of them is like has found the argument compelling enough, memorable enough, and intuitive enough, but also like surprising enough that they can recall these key details. And so what that means is that on the crafting end, before I even start writing, I spend a lot of time in those kinds of imaginary conversations with myself. And I am in the shower and on my run and dicing vegetables, like walking through the idea in my head because it needs to be coherent and efficient enough to like live in that form. And then if it passes that test, then it goes to the conversation test, which is me chit-chatting with people and saying like, "Hey, I was thinking about this. Like, what do you think about that?" And having smart friends and people I care about kind of push back. And then if it passes that test, it moves to the kind of outline or like very skeletal argument phase, which is like, usually I'm writing on like a legal pad or a whiteboard or something, just trying to sketch out the basic contours of what I want to say. And so before I ever sit down to like really, really get to work on something, I've already tried to put it through its paces a little bit, like kick the tires, make sure it doesn't leak, you know, choose your metaphor. But yeah, I've kind of stress tested it a little bit. And I think that makes my work easier in the sense that I try not to start something like that unless I feel like I know I'm right. Or, like I know that what I'm saying is defensible on a basic level. So, that's a big difference between how I do kind of prose work and how I do poetry. And then, comics is like I'm churning those joints out. I mean, they're due every month. They're very formulaic in a way that is actually liberating. Like my comics issues are 20 pages and they come out every month, and there are certain things that need to happen within those 20 pages every single time. The first 5 pages have to have something really engaging for the preview that folks are going to see before it drops. And you need to have cliffhangers, and you need to have like all these kinds of structural elements that I actually find really helpful because it's a little bit like paint by numbers in terms of the structural piece. And I think that enables me to be more imaginative in the other things that I have to use to make my comics great. Yeah, I feel like that covers most of them. But yeah, I think the point is that I engage in a form of capture that is also meant to kind of like creatively match the output of what I ultimately have to make, if that makes sense.
That makes so much sense. Oh my gosh, you truly are intelligent, as your niece said.
Thank you.
Oh, well, my gosh, this has been a treat. This has been a true treat for me.
Thank you,
And I'm so
Martine. You
pleased that
your
you
your
were
questions are so good.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you have were able to come on the show. We have so many things in common that we didn't talk about. I think we live in the same neighborhood in Chicago and we went to the same grad school. So wonderful all around. And I can't wait to read more of your work, especially your book that's coming out soon. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we end the show?
Yeah, I have like all the other insufferable writers, I have a Substack, so people can subscribe to that. It's called Pop Tabs, and it is specifically me overthinking pop culture and like putting forth my ridiculous ideas about Power Rangers and Black Panther and wrestling and children's books. And so if you like that particular brand of absurdity, you should subscribe to that. If you don't, you should not subscribe to it. uh, and yeah, I'm continuing my work on Exceptional X-Men, and folks should check that out. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Eve. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Hi there. If you're loving the show, would you mind taking a quick second to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite go-to podcast app? While you're at it, subscribe to our Substack newsletter, Creative Matters. You can find the link to subscribe in the show notes. All right, that's all that I have for you today. Bye.